David, firstly, thank you for joining us and welcome to the Housing Collective. For the listeners, could you just give us a brief introduction to yourself and your organisation?
Morning, Tom. Nice to see you. I'm David McQuade. I'm Chief Executive of Flagship Housing Group. Flagship's based in the east of England. We're a social housing group with about 32,000 properties across the east of England, predominantly operating Norfolk, Suffolk, north of Essex and Cambridgeshire, around that particular area. And in terms of our group, Tom, we've got 3 housing associations within it, each managing about 10,000 properties. We've got an in-house maintenance team as well, a DLO, which is fairly sizable, about 450 staff. We've got a gas company as well, which is interesting, about 400 members of staff there. They do a lot of group work, but also they have a retail element and a number of sort of commercial lines of activity as well. So that's kind of interesting for us. And then we've got, we're building about 800 homes a year, just short of 800 this year, a bit less than we wanted to because of the current operating environment. We're building about 800, aspirations to build about 1,000 if we can. And also as part of our group, we have a charitable arm called Hopestead, and we're investing about £1 million a year there in terms of preventing homelessness and related activities. So yeah, based in the east of England and in Norwich.
And it's fair to say then, David, just given some of that brief introduction, it's fair to say that you are pretty busy on a daily basis.
Yeah, I don't know many people that aren't busy at the moment, Tom. There's just so much going on, isn't there?
Yeah,
there really is. But I would say yes. I would argue that I'm fortunate to be very busy and a lot of things to look forward to and to try and do and achieve here. So yeah, big agenda, but I sort of, many associations in England, and yeah, so many people are busy at the moment. There's some big challenges out there.
Without a shadow of a doubt. And can you just share with us and for the listeners, David, about your journey to becoming Chief Exec of Flagship?
You want me to go back that far, do you?
Oh, if you...
well, my career started in Glasgow, Tom, in 1981, believe it or not. I was a housing trainee, started on the repairs desk. In those days we didn't have computers, we had a ticket, and I spent days endlessly writing out tickets. And then I was lucky enough to get to see other departments in city housing as well. At that time Glasgow was 180,000 homes, so it was a sizable organisation. Wow. And at the same time I did a wee housing degree at Glasgow Uni. So that was sort of start of my career with city housing in Glasgow, which was great. A great foundation, I think, for my future efforts. And I moved down to Kent in 1988. I was there for 5 or 6 years again, working for a housing association, Aristock Transfer. And then from that I came up to Suffolk in 1993 or thereabouts, and I became Director of Housing with again a stock transfer association, Suffolk Heritage. And it was in 1998 that Suffolk Heritage merged with Peddars Way to create Flagship in 1998. And I've been around Flagship since that time, really. I started out initially as a group director and deputy chief exec as well. And then in 2008 I became chief exec. So this year I'll be in the chief exec role about 15 years or so, and the company will be 25 years old. So that's my sort of... Yeah, that's a sort of backdrop to me. And I must admit, when I came to Kent, I didn't know much about Kent. Coming from Glasgow to Kent was kind of an interesting experience. You're going from a strongly Labour-controlled local authority, for example, and I came down to Kent, and it was very, very different in terms of the politics and the environment, and the housing markets were very, very different indeed. Glasgow, Tunbridge Wells, that's where I came to. It was very different, but again, great experience, and interestingly, both with challenging housing issues, regardless of the sort of operating area.
And how did you adapt to your style, Dave, from there? From Glasgow to Kent, it's two very different economies as well, but with different, as you say, there different housing needs. So did you have to adapt your style in any way?
You're assuming that I had a style there, Tom. That's still to be developed some years on. What I learned very quickly, it was very interesting because clearly Glasgow, certainly in the 1980s, and with some of the housing issues that Glasgow faced then, the levels of, you might say, deprivation, poverty, disrepair were pretty severe in parts of Glasgow at that time. and a lot of unemployment. When I left Glasgow in the early 1980s, unemployment was in the estate that I worked was sitting at 70-80%. What I noticed coming to Tunbridge Wells, it was a slightly more affluent area, unemployment less than 1%, and it was a very strong conservative local authority in place as well. But what I realised very quickly was there was really pressing housing issues in both places. Affordability was a huge issue in Tunbridge Wells in those days, even then, and with really low supply of affordable homes as well. So there was a bunch of stuff in both places that I learned very quickly. Although there was a difference in the backdrop, there was housing issues, and that was great from a learning point of view. And what I picked up there was that working in both Glasgow and in Kent, there was good things in both. There was areas that you'd want to improve in both around housing supply, housing issues, housing performance. But it was great as a young chap coming down and learning and using that again to my advantage in terms of my career and forward steps.
I could imagine. And we talk about your career, David. You say there you joined Flagship in a guise of Flagship back in 1998, so you've been chief exec for 15 years now. So how do you continue to challenge yourself and for those around you?
In 1998, Tom, we were still talking about housing crisis. So there was lots of challenges around issues then. Maybe it's more severe now, but there were still challenges around in terms of affordability, homelessness, lack of new supply. There are lots of issues around then. Sadly, there's still that issue about housing crisis, and it might even be more constrained, more difficult now. I don't think it's too difficult in our sector, in working for a housing group, a social housing group. It's not too difficult to look around for challenges. If you look over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, from the pandemic through to recovering from the pandemic, we threw in a little cyber attack just to mix things up. Then we had 12 months talking potential merger partners. It didn't happen. So, and then of course the cost of living crisis and all the impact that's had both on staff, on customers, on the economy. It's not short of challenges. You don't need to look too far in terms of the nature of what we do. I've never found through my entire career, and it's more so now, it's as challenging now as it was some years ago, but you need to be going around with a blindfold on not to see that there's an awful lot to do.
And on that, David, we talk about from a recruitment perspective that these leaders that come into the sector or for their first executive role or even on boards now, that they have to show so much resilience. So you've just mentioned a few pretty challenging times. I mean, you went through COVID, then you got hit by the cyber attack. I mean, you personally, how do you maintain that resilience?
Are we allowed to talk about different types of whiskey blends, Tom? I think whether you call it resilience, fortitude, determination, there are things both at work and life generally you try to do. I think at work, if you're surrounded by good colleagues, both at board and executive level and at all levels throughout the organisation, then I think that helps in terms of dealing with turbulence that you might face and being part of a team. And working together in that way to meet some of these big challenges. I think it's very important in terms of your health and well-being and supporting you as an individual or me as an individual. I think there are other things you can do too. For me, and I know I've talked to you about this before as well, but fitness, nutrition, lifestyle, and trying to get that balance in those things, sleeping well, doing exercise, trying to keep a perspective on life in amongst the daily toil of work and some of the pressures that you face. I think working hard to try and get that balance in your life just helps keep perspective and keeps you straight, really, in terms of trying to work through some of these big issues. And realising too that organisations and people, life's not perfect, so you're going to get thrown sideways from time to time. And I suppose there's something in that about making sure that both as an individual and organisationally that you're constantly developing, you're constantly learning, and you're using some of this learning to better advantage for the future. So, and having that both personally, open-minded, constantly learning, and that the organisation is like that too, then I think that all helps in terms of your journey forwards.
And how do you talk about that kind of arguably the culture of that continuous learning and wanting and needing to develop? How do you instill that into an organisation?
Yeah, that's a great point, really. I early on, I was quite lucky, probably maybe 10, 15 years ago. I came up, I started learning. I mean, you read so many different management books over the year, don't you? Yeah. And you learn from people, and you see what other companies are doing, as much outside the sector as inside, and you try and keep abreast of that. I was particularly struck with the whole concept and idea of systems thinking. I really loved the Toyota way and the continuous improvement journey there. And we spent quite a bit of time. There was John Seddon at Vanguard, a chap called John Little. We had them in to see us for a while. And it helped create something we called the Flagship Way, which was essentially a model that helped us try and build a culture of continuous improvement at all levels in the organisation. That allowed us to really try and understand what was going on in the organisation, what we could do about it, and how would you redesign it better with colleagues from a customer point of view, and how would it improve the business and the results you're getting. So we sort of used that methodology and learning to put in place something we call the Flagship Way, and that's something that's been sustained over a period of time for us. Since Flagship, since the early 2000s, 2002, 2000, no, a wee bit later than that. It was actually around about 2008, 2009, we started thinking in that way. And I think that's been quite instrumental in we haven't got it perfect, Tom, by any means, but I think one of the things I noticed it doing in the organisation was encouraging everyone to think, okay, what could we do better? To be thinking about not just the day job, as you might say, but also about the future. So service of today, but what might service of tomorrow look like? And that we've all got a responsibility as a team and creatively to think about that and work on it.
David, you talk about the Flagship Way and there's always that element of continuous learning. I'm just keen to understand now, if you look at the sector as a whole, there is some significant challenges that you're all facing. There's not only the media spotlight, you mentioned earlier around the reputational risk, if you can put it that way, but there's also Michael Gove and the Ombudsman and the challenges that brings. Can you just talk to us about what your thoughts are on this aspect?
It's really crystallised recently, hasn't it, in terms of the challenges, especially I think around stock condition. I think clearly the push on damp and mould, quite rightly, is something we have increased our diligence around and trying to do more and better in terms of performance now. And in assets generally, I think increased expectations, again, quite rightly, around EPCC, around the Decent Home Standard 2 coming along soon, around thinking about carbon reduction, net zero in future. I think all of those issues now certainly weigh heavy on our board's mind, on our executive. We are mindful that something like 50% of our stock is more than 50 years old.
Wow.
We're mindful that, and that's not unusual in the country. No, of course not. You know, the UK's got a fairly old stock relative to other European countries, for example. So I think we recognise the sort of scale of the challenge there in terms of investment, in terms of improving assets, and also it's not just about the homes that our customers live in, but also the estate fabric. You know, the need for some important regeneration in places as well. We've got a number of regeneration schemes we're looking at, and I think the challenge around all of that is how do you, with the resources that you've got and the skill set that you've got, how do you piece that together successfully over the course of the next 5, 10, 15 years to improve properties in the way that you would want to for customers and again for your asset base as a business. So I think there's some big issues there, and of course the inflationary pressures over the course of the last year, the uncertainty around the resources that you'll have available moving forward present all of us with a challenge there. And of course that's, to some extent, that's cemented by not really understanding your rent income moving forward, you know, in terms of any government determination there around rents, because clearly you're doing an awful lot of in investment in improving assets and regeneration work, but you're not necessarily recouping that in rental income. So there's some big challenges there, and in the operating environment where interest rates are higher, so you're paying more interest on your debt portfolio that you've got at variable rates, etc., and paying more for new money. All of that comes into the equation, really, about when you're juggling at board, about how you then prioritise and do all the things that you want to do. Because inevitably you need to phase it over a period of time, and it's never quick enough. You don't want to do it all quicker and sooner for customers as best you can, but inevitably you need to be sensible and phase it over a period of time.
And what do you think the future of housing will look like? Because you are under so many different conflicting agendas, but so much pressure as well. So in the future, what do you think housing will look like?
That's a big question, Tom.
How long have we got?
Yeah, that's a podcast in its own right, isn't it? In a couple of days. Well, I wish I had the answer to that question, I have to say. I think there's the interesting issue about existing stock and getting up to better standards and the investment required around that, and also regeneration. And I think that in itself is a pretty significant challenge for all of us. And it's not just social housing, that's the private rented market, that's in owner-occupied homes as well. There's a really big challenge in terms of assets over the next 10, 20 years linked to issues about net zero. So there's a really massive challenge there. But also there's a huge issue about supply. And what we're seeing, certainly, I think you see it in other parts of the country, but you certainly see it in the east of England as well, is excessive demand but very limited supply of new social housing and new affordable homes. So we're seeing bids per property for a 2 and 3 bedroom become vacant. Some of the more urban areas, you're looking at maybe 80, 90 families all bidding for a property. You're looking at some really excessive demand and very limited social housing being built at this moment in time. And I think there's an interesting dimension there as well about quite a big reliance on a small number of volume house builders in order to bring forward new supply. So there's some issues there, and of course there's the issues about modern methods of construction and house building moving in that direction, and it's probably been slower than maybe the government and we might want. It's certainly something people are pushing quite hard, but it's still, you might say, a cottage industry. It's not scaled up in the way that you might need if you were really to push on with MMC. Hopefully that will happen sooner rather than later. But I do think, and this is a personal view, not a flagship view, I think in terms of the future of housing, I see it with my own 4 kids who are struggling badly in terms of to buy homes and to pay high rents. Not just in East of England, but a couple of them live in London as well. So it's a really big challenge in that regard in terms of new supply. And I do think probably, and again, a bit more stress as a personal view, but I think government might need to intervene a bit more directly in terms of pushing on new supply. It might be through local government, through housing associations, but a range of means to really lift the volume of new homes that we're building, and maybe with some tinkering on the planning side as well. So I think, I don't think there's a silver bullet as such, but I think there's a range of pieces that government, that we in supporting the government in that endeavour will need to put in play, but I think it needs to be ramped up quite a bit in terms of the number of new homes that we're building and the type of new homes. So again, I'm hopeful that some of the new modern methods of construction, some of the new technologies coming along maybe within the next 5 to 10 years. I've been intrigued by some of the 3D printing that you see going on in different parts of the world, and it maybe doesn't look the prettiest, but it looks pretty functional in places that we've had a couple of colleagues in our development team looking at it alongside modern methods of construction. So there is hopefully new technology that will come in the next few years that will underpin any renewed effort to deal with the future of housing and some of the housing issues that we face in this country. Really interesting.
Thank you, David. And flagship housing could have looked very different today given the conversations that you were having last year. So if we take it back, in April 2022, it was well documented that you were in discussions with BPHA and Futures Housing Group to create a three-way merger, which you were yourself was to lead that 60-unit merged RP. So can you just talk to us about that journey of those discussions?
Yes, it was. I thoroughly enjoyed the discussions, Tom. It may sound a bit daft because it didn't come off in the end, which was a great pity, but I enjoyed it. There's maybe something in biting off more than we could chew with a three-way that was interesting in terms of trying to bring that together. Just small things like the logistics in terms of getting three sets of organisations agreeing things, meetings and shared objectives and all that sort of stuff. So there was a dynamic about the three-way that was probably more challenging, certainly two-way, one-to-one mergers I've been involved in the past. And there's some learning in that, to be sure. But what was kind of interesting for us was when we started talking with Futures and BPHA, I think it was late 2021, early 2022. So at that stage, we didn't have the war in Ukraine. The cost of living crisis wasn't necessarily in play to the same extent. The economy wasn't deteriorating in the way that it did then in the early and middle part of 2022. When we started looking in early 22 about a combined business case between the three organisations, it was really very strong, provided we got the renegotiation on legacy loans with the banks. We got a good deal on that. The added debt potential and the ability to invest in the existing stock to take on all those challenges that we talked about and to build more new homes, it was really very promising when you looked in early 2022. But as the landscape changed, and it really did change, then when you were getting towards the summer to September, early October, and it was in September really the sort of tipping point, I suppose. It was the quasi-Kwarteng sort of budget at that point, when financial markets were in a meltdown, when all three organisations, like others in the sector, were feeling more distressed because business plans were being challenged, especially with the cost of living crisis and the impact on everyone. And it got into the too difficult category at that point, and looking at the combined business case, looking at negotiating with the banks at that stage who were having their own challenges with financial markets, and looking at the comparison with the assumptions that we made in the combined business case in early February 2022 and thereabouts, I think it just meant it got into the too difficult camp. So that was disappointing for all of us, but it was the right decision. We could have said to each other, well, let's hold out for 6 months, let's see if markets calm down, if interest rates do sort of go back down, or what happens to the economy. But I don't think anyone was keen at that point. We'd already been talking for 10, 11 months or thereabouts. No one was keen at that point to wait, and I think that was the sensible call for each of the three organisations, because we all had a lot of stuff we wanted to get on with anyway, and you inevitably just slow a little when you're discussing some of these issues about a new combined organisation. So it didn't land. It was a pity, but I certainly learned a great deal. Flagship benefited tremendously from seeing what BPHA and Futures were up to in more detail. All of that was very helpful. So although it didn't happen, hopefully we'll be stronger for it moving forward.
You talk about there, David, around that learning aspect. I mean, what you were also going to be that chief exec of that newly merged organisation. So what impact did it have on you? And arguably more importantly, what did you learn from that process?
I was looking forward to being chief exec. I think being part of an organisation like that, the big challenge for all of us, we were keen and pretty determined to create something with that scale, but of course to do it well from a local perspective, meeting customers' needs. We know that having the strength of that scale, but equally getting the customer service bit right was the ambition. So that's that for me personally, that was great. So I think certainly in terms of learning, it was great to get so close to BPHA and Futures, to have those discussions around business plans, service levels, to see how they operated at board, executive level, see inside their organisation. You don't often get that chance, and we had plenty of opportunity to swap notes. They were doing some stuff that was great. They were both probably a bit further on than us in a few places. We picked up some great tips around, doing some great work around CRM. Some of them, BPHA had pushed on some really good stuff around assets. That was useful for us in looking at Flagship and our journey and our stage of progress. And likewise, I think we had some good things that they would probably say that they thought worked pretty well. So from that perspective, both for me personally, for our board and for our senior leaders, staff colleagues, although disappointed, you've got to take the positives from it, and there were plenty. What's interesting about that, Tom, is when you looked at all three, and this is an interesting debate amongst chief execs in the sector and others in the sector as well, I think predominantly we were all trying to do much the same thing around customer services, around services to customers. There was an awful lot of commonality in approach in terms of challenges that we faced, and you really could see how sensibly bringing that together in a cohesive way, had we had the opportunity, could really bring some advantage.
And this was an 11, as you say there, 10, 11-month discussions. And what I'm really keen to understand, and this is a conversation that is had across the UK, is that during a merger process, it is well documented that for leaders and boards, it takes a significant amount of time away from the day job. So how do you keep your teams motivated on exactly that whilst also working towards a merger in the background?
See, I think, Tom, and I'm not being flippant here, but I think the day job is working with BPHA and Futures to create a better future for our customers, tenants generally at large, and for meeting housing needs. To me, that's the day job. I get the issue. I know what you're hinting at in terms of, well, your existing organisations, you've got obviously a clear duty there to make sure that things don't fall through the cracks and performance doesn't suffer and it doesn't slow you down. In reality, it does slow you down in a few places because inevitably your eye is on other things, certainly as an executive team, and you do make certain decisions. So we would have, had we not been in discussions with colleagues there at BPHA and Futures, probably 6 months earlier, or maybe even a bit longer than that, we would have progressed IT issues in terms of new systems. We slowed down on some purchase there, whether it be CRM or some asset stuff, some other areas of activity where you started to think a bit differently. As you looked at both those organisations, you might think, well, we'll not progress here because this will happen come the new combined organisation. So, but there are things that you inevitably slow down on, and of course you got the issue about staffing as well. Some people quite naturally have got their eye not just on their job now, but what happens in future. So you've got to deal with some of those uncertainties as well. So that's an interesting process that you've just got to try and balance as best you can in terms of people in the organisation and the organisation's performance. And if you've got the right people in the right seats round about you, and I felt we did have, and that's managed well. But it does slow up certain things. I'm not going to hide from that. It'd be a bit daft for me to say that it didn't.
But it's interesting as well, David, your views on this, and this arguably goes back to the point that you made around the Flagship way, is that you take the positives out of that, which, yes, it was a shame, but actually let's take the positives and let's look at what we've learned from those two other organisations, which I think is a fascinating view to have as well. Goodness
me, yes. I mean, that's life, isn't it? You know, you go into some of these things and it's not guaranteed when you strike up these conversations it will materialise. So I think, and it's a great opportunity, isn't it, to compare and contrast what you're doing with other folk, and I think we've benefited from that. And that the truth is, Tom, the next partnership we try to do or think about, hopefully will benefit from our learning there, and the talent in the organisation that I've got at Flagship, for example, the people, they learn, they pick up. It's fascinating in terms of seeing their journey and how they coped with the tensions and the pressure, working with two other organisations, and it's all helps your armoury as you build your leadership approach into the future. So for me, there's an awful lot of good news there, albeit it didn't happen in the end. But there'll be other opportunities, and because inevitably, with the whole backdrop that we've discussed, housing associations will want to collaborate. They will want to share risk and reward, and they will want to create new models to deal with, you know, the future of housing question that you've talked about earlier, that we've touched on. Yeah, it's absolutely inevitable and right that we do. Definitely, and as you mentioned earlier, David, that wasn't your first merger neither. So you talk around
the challenges that are going ahead in the future of housing, as you know, and you've just mentioned there around Flagship, M&A is still a priority, strategic priority for many boards. So given what you've just gone through and also the mergers that you've carried out in the past, do you have any advice for chief execs and boards that are starting those discussions with other housing associations?
Don't do it during a cost of living crisis and a quasi-quartang mini budget. I suppose there's something in Tom is trying to work with people with like minds, with shared objectives. Although I find many associations do have very similar objectives, like minds. If they can get over the bit about who's going to be in charge, whether it be at board or chief exec level, or executives, if they can get over that bit. And I understand the issue about looking after your own organisation and having a duty of care and responsibility about that. I think one of the interesting challenges for executives is at times like that to focus on what might be, to some of the advantages that a new combined entity might really bring. Again, against the backdrop of the challenges that we face, and I think that's quite important. Very often people get locked into their way of doing things. It's our way, or inevitably these discussions, you always do it the best way. And I think if you can be really open-minded and be thinking more creatively about what might be, I think that's helpful. I suppose the other thing is, being kind of a big lesson for us is, if it is a time of economic upheaval, and certainly the banks are in a challenging position as well, and the economy is less than settled, and that's been the case over the last year or so, then I do think the whole issues about treasury and renegotiating sort of legacy debts and new funding that you might want for any new combined organisation, this is probably the earlier that you can bring transparency around that and have an underpinning sort of treasury and financial plan is probably a good thing to do as soon as possible as well. Alongside getting to meet, trust and build confidence with boards and executives. So, but I would say that's the sort of positives or how I would respond to your question, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. And as you say, no mini budget.
No mini budget. I'm sure I've missed out other things as well, but and you can't account for the external things that come along and bumps in the road, but it certainly wasn't helpful in our case.
As you look forward then, Flagship, second half of the year now, David, what are Flagship's strategic priorities for the rest of the financial year? For the rest of the financial year, our board has agreed 4 priorities. It's this is a particular focus in the next 12 months. We've got quite a big sales programme on our development side, Tom. Well, it's big for us really in terms of asset sales. Our turnover is about 260 million a year. About 60 million-ish of that is around sales this financial year. So we're watching that very closely in terms of the outright sales we've got and the shared ownership, for example, and that's a very focused, watching how housing markets are performing. So far they're holding up well. A wee bit slower in some places in terms of traffic coming through the door. That's a big focus. Damp and mould, we're mindful that we want to get it even more right for the winter period coming up, so there's a real opportunity in the summer to focus on that and make sure that we get that bit right. We've got a new asset plan. It comes back to the conversation we've had earlier around upgrading properties, EPC by 2030 and getting ready. We've got a big programme of air source heat pumps that we're putting in. Again, we're putting in about 1,000 a year or thereabouts if we can. That whole piece around air source heat pumps, asset management is a big one for us moving forward. And of course, in amongst all of that is getting systems in place where we can do better around how we coordinate asset information, talking to other parts of the organisation, and just having stronger systems around IT related issues in relation to asset as well. So that's a big priority for us. And the other sort of 4th theme for the board is consumer regulation. So we've done some pilots on the tenant satisfaction measures there, and pushing on with all of that and the wider context of the social housing regulation bill, etc. So another big theme over the next 12 months that we want to get right. So whilst the board's got a number of sort of strategic objectives over the next 5 years, those sort of 4
the sort of big priorities that they've certainly got their eye to and attention on from the board's point of view. So plenty to do there, I have to say. Big challenging agenda.
Like you say, you're busy, the boards are busy, but as you say, as you rightfully said, kind of the rest of the UK is busy as well. So David, honestly, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, so thank you. But before I let you go, we do finish with some quick fire questions, so I'll kind of try and keep these straight to the point. So what has been your most valuable leadership lesson that you've learned?
Surround yourself with a lot of people that are brighter than you and just work bloody hard. Yeah. So I think a big thing, Tom, running an organisation like Flagship now, it's about the team and about teamwork, and I include the board and executive in that, and then the executive and other senior leaders. You just can't run a place like this successfully or well without a really strong corporate team effort. So teamwork is the key, and you being part of that team is vitally important. So that's certainly for me important in terms of leadership.
And what advice would you give to an aspiring leader starting out on their journey?
Yeah, work hard. Work hard diligently, be passionate about what you do, be open-minded, listen carefully, and you're learning every day of the week. So that sort of strong professional will about what you want to achieve, but importantly in all of that, a big dose of humility, because you're only as good as the team run about you. What
do you believe to be the key leadership qualities required in today's world?
Yeah, I think that professional will, that sort of determination, that style of leadership. I think with the issue about humility being part of the team, I think for me, I would roll that into that answer, Tom. I think those sort of qualities are very important. And you talked earlier about resilience or fortitude, whatever you call it. But things go wrong. Organisational life's not straightforward. Life, the external environment, it's not straightforward. So you need to deal with setbacks. You need to accept things will go pear-shaped. You'll make decisions that don't work out, but you've got to keep learning from it and try and make as many good ones as you can.
And final question, David, one leadership book that you'd recommend to the listeners?
Leadership book? I think there's two, Tom. I like Good to Great, Jim's Collins. Some of the concepts in that, I really do like that in terms of his level 5 leadership. Again, talks a lot there about professional will, humility, and I think and the stuff he does about the flywheel, the hedgehog concept, and the Stockdale paradox. There's reading in that. There's stuff in that that's been very useful, I've found over the years, combined with, again mentioned earlier, but systems thinking in the public sector by John Said, and I found very useful as well. And a combination of those two books for me, they're a good read.
David, thank you so much for joining us on the Housing Collective podcast. I've genuinely enjoyed our hour's conversation, so thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Yeah, nice to see you, Tom. All the best.